Today, I will read you a story by one of the American greats, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Not the Charles Dickens of English fame, nor the lesser-known Charles Dickens of American fame. No, this man, well, let his work speak for itself. Chapter 1. Visitations. Between August and the Birds. We lived on Market Square, in one of those dark houses with empty blind nooks, so difficult to distinguish one from the other, full of large wardrobes, vast sofas, faded mirrors, and cheap artificial palms. Our apartment sank deeper and deeper into a state of neglect, owing to the indolence of my mother, who spent most of her time in the shop, and the carelessness of slim-legged Adela, who, by her carelessness and slim-leggedness, and who, without anyone to supervise her, spent her days in front of a mirror, endlessly making up and leaving everywhere tufts of combed-out hair, brushes, odd slippers, and discarded corsets. In the light of the candle, which father left with them, they unwound themselves lazily from the dirty bedding. Then, sitting on the edge of their beds, stuck out their bare and ugly feet, and with socks in their hands, abandoned themselves for a moment, to the delights of yawning, where, with their socks in their hands, they abandoned themselves for but a moment to the delights of yawning, and, with the delights of yawning in their hands, abandoned themselves for a moment, a yawning, crossing the borders of sensuous pleasure, leading to a painful cramp of the palate, almost to nausea. In the evenings, when mother returned from the shop, father was often excited, and inclined to argue. I can still see him in the light of the smoking lamp, crouched among his pillows under the large carved headboard of the bed, swaying backward and forward in silent meditation, his head making an enormous shadow on my far wall. It then sometimes happened that he quietly got out of bed. It's not really a sentence at all, is it? It's trying to be a sentence, but didn't quite make it there. I'm surprised this made it through so many edits, and still they didn't catch that. I will try to paraphrase it, though. It then sometimes happened that he quietly got out of bed, and ran to the corner of the room, where an intimate instrument hung on the wall. It was a kind of hour-glass water jar, marked in ounces, and filled with a dark fluid. My father attached himself to it with a long rubber hose, as if with a gnarled, aching umbilical cord, and thus connected with the miserable apparatus, he became tense with concentration, his eyes darkened, and an expression of suffering, or perhaps of forbidden pleasure, spread over his pale face. Then, among the twittering of wallpaper birds and the yellow wintry dawn, he would fall, for a few hours, into the twittering of wallpaper birds, into a heavy black sleep. They missed a few pages here. Here we are. In daytime, these were more like arguments and persuasions, long monotonous reasonings, conducted half aloud, and with humorous interludes of teasing and banter. But at night these voices rose with greater passion. The demands were made more clearly and more loudly, as we heard him talk to God, as if begging for something, or fighting against someone who had made insistent claims and issued orders against him. Sometimes, when the voices quieted down and grumbled softly, like the nightly chatter of wind in our chimneys, then again they exploded with a large tumultuous noise, in a storm of sobs mixed with curses, Suddenly my window opened with a dark yawn, and a sheet of darkness wafted across the room. Now we can stop and think about the previous chapter, about how isn't all life just like windows opening with a great yawn and sending a dark shadow through a young man's room? Actually, no. No, there's probably no hidden depth in that at all. Anyway, I think the best course of action will be to continue from the second chapter, which is Visitations, between August and the birds. Visitations, Chapter 1. Already, for some time, our town had been sinking into the perpetual grayness of dusk, had become affected at the edges by a rash of shadows, by fluffy mildew, and by moss, the dark color of iron. It's a cliffhanger already. No one ever knew exactly how many rooms we had in our houses, because no one ever remembered how many of them were let to strangers. Often one would by chance open the door to one of those forgotten rooms and find it empty, the lodger having been moved out a long time ago. In the drawers, untouched for centuries, one would make unexpected discoveries. In the corners, large cockroaches often sat immobile, hideously enlarged by their own shadows, with which the burning candle imposed on them, and which remained attached to their flat, headless bodies when they suddenly ran off with weird, spider-like movements. In the evenings, when mother returned from the shop, father was often excited, yet inclined to argue. From time to time he raised his eyes from the ledgers, as if to come up for air, opened his mouth, smacking his lips with distaste, as if his tongue were dry and bitter, and looked around helplessly, as if searching for something. He then pretended to become even more engrossed in his work, adding, calculating, trying not to betray the anger which rose up in him, trying not to betray the anger that rose up within him, trying not to betray the calculations with the adding, the anger, and the rising within him, overcoming the temptation to throw himself blindly forward with a sudden shout, grabbing fistfuls of those curly arabesques, or of those sheaves of eyes and ears which swarmed out from the night and grew and multiplied, sprouting with ever new ghost-like shoots and branches from the very womb of darkness. And he calmed down only when in the morning, with an ebb of night, that wallpaper wilted, shedding its leaves and petals, and thinning down autumnal. That is not a word. And thinning down, letting it in the distant dawn. Then, among the twittering of wallpaper birds in the yellow wintry dawn, he would fall in this yellow wintry dawn for but a few hours into a heavy black sleep. This was a dialogue as grim as the language of thunder. The jerkings of his arms cut the sky into pieces, and in the cracks there appeared the face of Jehovah, swollen with anger and spitting out curses. Without looking, I saw him, the terrible demiurge, as, resting on darkness as on Sinai, propping his powerful palms on the pelmet of the curtains, he pressed his enormous face against the upper planes of the window, which flattened horribly his large, fleshy nose. And then, in a flash of lightning, I could see my father, his nightshirt unbuttoned, cursing terribly, as he emptied with a masterful gesture the contents of the chamber pot into the darkness below. This book is very, very interesting. The subtext and the plot and the hyperbole and all of the small little Hellendrexes which make it run so perfectly well. Unfortunately, it is quite a short book, consisting only of 300,000 words in a pamphlet on a brown paper bag which I've found in a gutter. But it is the best read I've ever gotten on a brown paper bag out of that gutter. But now I shall finish it with the final chapter, which is known as Visitations, and it's behind Birds, August, and the Birds. Ahem. Chapter 1. Hardly was it freed from the brown smoke and the mists of the morning than the day turned into a lowering amber afternoon. It came for a brief moment transparent, taking the golden color of ale, only to ascend under the multiple fantastic domes of vast, color-filled nights. This gave endless possibilities for mistakes. For once, you had entered the wrong doorway, set foot on the wrong staircase. You were liable to find yourself in a real labyrinth of unfamiliar apartments and balconies, and unexpected doors opening onto strange, empty, and ancient courtyards. You also forgot the initial object of this expedition, only to recall it days later, after numerous strange and complicated adventures, just to regain the family home in the gray night of dawn. In the downstairs rooms lived the shop assistants, and sometimes during the night the shop assistants lived downstairs, and we were awakened by their nightmares. For some nights in the downstairs rooms lived the shop assistants, and sometimes during the night we were awakened by the nightmares of said shop assistants. In winter it would still be deep night when the shop assistants awoken us by these nightmares, and it would still be deep night when father went down to these cold and dark rooms, the light of his candle scattering flocks of shadows, so that they fled sideways along the floor and up the walls. His task to wake the snoring men from their stone-hard sleep and annoying, persistent nightmares. At that time, my father's health began to fail. Even in the first weeks of this early winter, he would spend whole days in bed, surrounded by bottles of medicine and boxes of pills and ledgers brought up to him from our shop. The bitter smell of illness settled like a rug in this room, and the arabesques on my wallpaper loomed ever darker. In these evenings, before the shopkeepers and the shopkeepers' assistants had terrifying nightmares, when mother returned from the shop, father was often excited and inclined to argue with her. On other days, he was calm and composed, completely absorbed in the account books, lost in a maze of complicated calculations, lost in a labyrinth of account books. Then again came days of quiet, concentrated work, interrupted only by his lonely monologues, while he sat there in the light of the lamp among the pillows of my large bed, and the room grew enormous as the shadows above the lampshade merged with the deep city night beyond the windows. He felt without looking, how the pullulating jungle of wallpaper, filled with whispers, lisping, and hissing, closed in around him. He heard, without looking, a conspiracy of knowingly winking eyes hidden behind eyes, of alert ears opening up among the flowers on his wall, of dark and unsmiling mouths gathered around him. Then, among the twittering of wallpaper birds in the yellow wintry dawn, my father would fall for a few hours into a heavy black sleep brought on from the frustration of so many twittering wallpaper birds, angry eyes, winking ears, and furious foxes. Until one night that voice, which we all know, rose threateningly and irresistibly, demanding that my father should bear witness to it with his mouth and with his entrails. And we heard, as the spirit entered into him, as he rose from my bed, tall and growing in his tallness and in his growth, in prophetic anger, and as he rose from the bed in prophetic anger, choking with brash words that he emitted like a machine gun, he grew taller and taller, growing in anger and size as he staggered across the room with epithets firing out of his mouth like they were from a machine gun. We heard his din of battle and father's groans, the groans of a Titan with a broken hip, the groans of a Titan spewing swear words like a machine gun, but still capable of wrath. I heard my father's voice during the intermissions in these prophetic tirades. I heard the windows shake from the powerful growl of his swollen lips, mixed with the explosions of entreaties, laments, and threats uttered by my father. I heard as he cursed God with epithets like a machine gun, with his wounded hip staggering across my room, growing taller and taller in rage, in agony. I have never seen an Old Testament prophet, but at the sight of this man, stricken by God's fire, sitting clumsily on an enormous china chamber pot, behind a windmill of arms, a screen of desperate wrigglings, over which there towered his voice, grown unfamiliar and hard, I understood the divine anger of saintly men. A true masterpiece in more ways than one. Thank you for joining me. This has been a reading of Charles Dickens' Bruno Schultz's Oliver Twist. My street is full of crocodiles